He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. It was the night of October 24th, 1493, one night after the signing of the Treaty of the Convention of Thorns. For the 7 founders of the Camarilla, all seemed to be going well. The Anarch Revolt was effectively over, the vast majority having agreed to the terms of the treaty and being reabsorbed into the ranks of the Camarilla. Sure, there were the Assamites still to contend with, but at least there was one less enemy to deal with, and the few Anarch malcontents that had refused could be dealt with in due time. Or so they thought, for there were many among the Anarchs yet who refused to admit defeat. In particular, the Anarchs of clans La Sombra and Tzimisce. It was all well and fine for the Anarchs of other clans to go back into the Camarilla fold, but the La Sombra and Tzimisce had gone farther than anyone else had. They had diablerized their own antediluvians and seized power from their clan elders with their own hands. As far as they were concerned, the Rubicon was crossed. There was no going back to what had been before. There would be no submitting to the authority of elders as though nothing had happened, as if the Anarch Revolt had not mattered in the slightest. And so, the night of October 24th, they decided to show the Camarilla exactly what they thought of their authority. Led by the Tzimisce Micah Vikos, these hardline anarchs descended upon the town of Silchester, England. Not only did they slaughter the mortals en masse and consume their blood, but they also made full display of their supernatural powers in direct and deliberate violation of the masquerade. By the time the Camarilla leaders learned of the attack and arrived at Silchester, all that remained was a bloody shambles and a few shell-shocked survivors, who babbled about beings they described as Sabbats of witches and devils. Through the combined efforts of the Camarilla founders, the memories of the surviving mortals were erased, thus preserving the masquerade. That task completed, the Camarilla founders vowed then and there to hunt down these Anarch hardliners until there was none left. And thus, in that event known as Hasaldema, the Field of Blood, was born the Sabbat. If the Camarilla is a loose, global feudal organization defined by rigid hierarchy, the Sabbat can best be compared to a religious terrorist organization. They are a bizarre combination of fanatical cult and paramilitary organization. Where the Camarilla reject most of the stories of the origins of vampires, up to and including the denial of the existence of the antediluvians, the Sabbat not only believe that the antediluvians are real, but that they are the secret masterminds of the Camarilla, the true ultimate enemy that the Sabbat must destroy. Where the Camarilla rejects the prophecies of Gehenna, the Sabbat believe it wholeheartedly. They believe that Cain will one day return and pass final judgment on all vampires, especially his murderous grandchilder, the antediluvians, and that when that day comes, the Sabbat shall be the army with which Cain destroys his wayward kin. Thus, many Sabbat vampires like to refer to themselves and their sect as the Sword of Cain. While the Camarilla focuses on enforcing the masquerade, as they believe secrecy is the only way to ensure the survival of all vampires, the Sabbat essentially take the position of Deacon Frost from the 1998 Blade movie.
Maybe it's time we forgot about discretion. We should be ruling the humans, not running around making back alley treaties with them. For fuck's sake, these people are our food.
But, out of pragmatism, they know that for now, their survival does depend on maintaining secrecy. Besides, they know full well that if they did come out into the open, the Camarilla and all the independent clans would just sit back and let the Sabbat be exterminated by the humans. Finally, while the Camarilla believes that only by maintaining one's humanity, that final stunted remnant of a mortal soul that is left after the embrace, may vampires avoid becoming mindless wights, the Sabbat embrace various philosophical teachings called the Paths of Enlightenment, different ways and means by which they embrace their inner beast without being ruled by it. To the Sabbat, the idea of clinging to one's humanity is ludicrous. Vampires are not human. They're more than human. They're better than human. Though they reject the old hierarchy of elders and Methuselahs that the Camarilla so eagerly embrace, the Sabbat too has a hierarchy of its own. Of course, in their characteristic spirit of defiance and perversity, most of the offices within the Sabbat are religious titles in mocking parody of the church. At the very top of the organization is a singular leader known as the Regent. Although technically in command of the Sabbat, in keeping with the original spirit of revolt and defiance of authority that so marked the first Anarch Revolt, the authority of the Regent is far more nominal than that of, say, the inner circle of the Camarilla. The Regent can set policy for the sect as a whole, but most Sabbats are free to interpret the Regent's commands as it suits their own interests. That being said, the sect as a whole will mostly go along with what the Regent wants. Unlike in the Camarilla, which is so divided by factionalism on the basis of either clan, domain, or individual interest, held in check only by the iron-fisted rule of princes or the inner circle, all members of the Sabbat, from the highest to the lowest, are united by a strong sense of shared purpose, to carry on the fight against the Camarilla and its antediluvian puppet masters. The Regent is chosen by the Consistory, a governing body comprised of various regional leaders known as cardinals. Below the cardinals in turn are the archbishops, who oversee individual domains and are essentially the Sabbat equivalent of a Camarilla prince. These senior Sabbat members are supported by advisors known as the Prisci and are protected by a coterie of bodyguards/enforcers known alternately as Templars or Paladins. Beneath the archbishops are the bishops, who oversee the various departments of a domain, and below the bishops are the packs. Small groups of Sabbat vampires united by common interest and a shallow form of blood bond known as the Vinculum. Each pack includes a ductus, who serves as overall leader, particularly in secular matters, and a priest, who functions as the equivalent of an army chaplain, responsible for seeing to the spiritual needs of individual members of the pack. Following the Field of Blood in 1493, the Sabbat was initially slow to unify into a single sect. Heavily outnumbered by the equally nascent Camarilla, the early Sabbat mostly comprised of various packs waging guerrilla warfare against the Camarilla, while also trying to avoid final death at the hands of the Shadow Inquisition. Eventually, though, after a series of meetings on the island of Majorca between the various senior members of the Sabbat, the sect finally began to unify into a single movement. Then, in the Italian city of Milan, those same senior leaders drafted the governing principles of the sect known as the Code of Milan. More importantly, by now word was spreading across Europe of a certain Christopher Columbus, who claimed to have returned having discovered a western sea route to Asia. In actuality, though, Columbus had discovered an entirely new continent, the Americas. With the Camarilla slowly but surely entrenching itself as the dominant force in Europe, many among the Sabbat, especially the younger members, decided to jump ship and set sail for the New World in the hopes of establishing domains for themselves. By the time the Camarilla realized what was happening, it was too late. The Sabbat was firmly entrenched in the Americas, and they were going to make damn sure that no servant of the Ivory Tower could so much as set foot in their territory. They managed to make that last for about 200 years, and then they started fighting among themselves and everything went snafu. There have been a total of 4 civil wars in the history of the Sabbat's existence, but the first one is the most significant and the only one that need concern us here. In 1786, shortly after the conclusion of the American Revolution, the American Semizi and La Sombra began fighting among themselves for territory and domain in the New World. Spying the opportunity, the Camarilla did not hesitate to act for a change. Within 30 years, they managed to secure a foothold within the eastern seaboard of the United States. And while they never made much headway into Canada or Mexico over the next few centuries, the Camarilla did at least manage to end Sabbat monopoly of America and become a dominant force in that part of the continent. The First Sabbat Civil War only came to an end on September the 19th, 1803, after a prominent Zimitzi named Radu Bistri metaphorically smacked enough heads together and made the American Sabbat realize that by fighting among themselves, they were doing their enemies' work for them. Thus, the warring sides finally agreed to sign the Purchase Pact, which essentially forbade fellow Sabbat members from waging open conflict against one another under penalty of diablerie, and demanded a more strict adherence to the Code of Milan. The Sabbat are usually perceived as chaotic evil to the Camarilla's lawful evil, and that's technically true, but reading the Code of Milan makes you realize very quickly that the supposed great rebels have more rules to follow than the Camarilla does. It has a total of 13 statutes and reads as follows. 1. The Sabbat shall remain united in its support of the sect's regent. If necessary, a new regent shall be elected. The regent shall support relief from tyranny, granting all Sabbat freedom. 2. The Sabbat shall do their best to serve their leaders as long as said leaders serve the will of the regent. 3. All Sabbat shall faithfully observe all the auctoritas rite. 4. All Sabbat shall keep their word of honor to one another. 5. All Sabbat shall treat their peers fairly and equally, upholding the strength and unity of the Sabbat. If necessary, they shall provide for the needs of their brethren. 6. All Sabbat must put the good of the sect before their own personal needs despite all costs. 7. Those who are not honorable under this code will be considered less than equal and therefore unworthy of assistance. 8. As it had always been, so it shall always be. The lex talionis shall be the model for immortal justice by which all Sabbat shall abide. 9. All Sabbat shall protect one another from the enemies of the sect. Personal enemies shall remain personal responsibility unless they undermine sect security. 10. All sect members shall protect Sabbat territory from all other powers. 11. The spirit of freedom shall be the fundamental principle of the sect. All Sabbat shall expect and demand freedom from their leaders. 12. The rights of monomacy shall be used to settle disputes among all Sabbat. 13. All Sabbat shall support the Black Hand. The Black Hand being the elite military arm of the Sabbat. All members of the Sword of Cain are technically soldiers in the good fight against the Camarilla and its elders, but the Black Hand are the elite fighters, the best of the best. But more than any laws, the Sabbat are defined by their rituals, the aforementioned auctoritas rite. 13 specific rites that all Sabbat members are required to observe. They are as follows. The Binding. Always held on the winter solstice, this is a mostly sober, by Sabbat standards, ceremony where local members gather to reaffirm their commitment to the cause. It takes the form of a ceremonial oath to the Sabbat, and whenever possible is held next to a body of water. The idea being that, like the water which can flow around any obstruction, the Sabbat will one day find a way to overcome its enemies. Any body of water will suffice for the ceremony, a beach, a waterfall, a river, a fountain if necessary. If water just isn't available, the pack will make do with a piece of white cloth to symbolize the water. The blood bath, a rite always performed to recognize a sect member's advancement to a position of power, bishop, cardinal, etc. All present take turns kneeling before the newly promoted Cainite and show their support through verbal affirmation and by spilling some of their own vitae into a large vessel. The vampire in question then bathes in said donated vitae, which is then drunk up by the members of the gathering, symbolizing their willingness to partake of what this new leader has to offer. Most Sabbat are real sticklers for the bloodbath and refuse to follow a leader who has not been consecrated by such a rite. The Blood Feast, one of their more notorious rites. It functions as a grisly inversion of a Camarilla Elysium. It is a social gathering for Sabbat members to mingle, with the added twist of several kidnapped humans and the occasional non-Sabbat vampire strung up from chains and then fed upon by the attendant Sabbat as the meeting goes on. The Creation Rite. This has the most variation as it depends on both the clan that the new vampire belongs to and the particular pack and/or domain that they are a part of. The only consistent factor is that the attendant priest burns the new Sabbat with a flaming brand in the belief that it will reduce the new vampire's fear of fire. During times of war, the Sabbat may resort to what is known as the shovelhead method. They gather a bunch of hapless humans, embrace them, then bash them over the head and bury them in the ground. By the time the newly embraced vampires awaken 6 feet under, their brand new thirst for blood has already put them into a state of frenzy, and they have to claw their way back to the surface. The Festivo dello Estinto, or Festival of the Dead. Always taking place during the entire second week of March, it's essentially a giant celebration of the fact that they're immortal vampires. The exact festivities vary from place to place, but it almost always ends with a massive blood feast. The entertainments can vary from the kind of semi-classy ballroom scenes you see in many vampire films to, say, the bloodbath scene from Blade. The fire dance, often used to demonstrate that while the Sabbat fear fire as all vampires do, they are not afraid to use it against their enemies. A large bonfire is lit somewhere safe from the eyes of mortals, and all Sabbat present dance around it to the beating of drums. The ceremony concludes with all present taking turns leaping through the flames. Games of instinct. These function essentially as training exercises officiated by the pack priests. Their purpose is to keep the Sabbat's predatory skills honed, and can range from parodies of cops and robbers to jumping off of tall buildings and seeing who can take the most damage and walk away. Monomacy, which is essentially vampiric duel to final death, a way for various members of the sect to resolve grievances and ensure strong leadership. There are no established rules except for those agreed upon by the participants. The Pala Grande, or Grand Ball, held once a year, of course, on Halloween. A massive entertainment usually disguised as a social gathering or a rave so as to lure as many mortals as possible to be partaken of by the attending Cainites. Many bloodbaths and blood feasts are performed throughout the event, as well as theatrical reproductions of events from Cainite mythology, from the story of Cain himself to recreations of the prophecies of Gehenna. The Pala Grande is always the high point of the Sabbat calendar. The Sermons of Cain. Among the Sabbat, unsurprisingly, there are many Nodists, those who believe in the veracity of the Book of Nod, and its portrayal of the origins of vampires. While not all Sabbats are Nodists, and many in fact don't give a damn, the sermons, which are usually various pack members reading aloud from the Book of Nod, are used to remind them of where they came from and to remind them of their shared purpose. Valderry, perhaps the most famous Auctoritas Rite. Originally invented by the Tzimitzi clan during the Anarch Revolt as a way of breaking the blood bonds between elder regnants and younger thralls. Each member of a pack drips some of their vitae into a communal cup. The vitae is then mixed with a substance called Kupala's fire flower. While the pack priest performs consecration, the cup is then passed around and all pack members partake. This creates the vinculum, the thin communal blood bond that binds the pack together and essentially overwrites any other previous blood bond, ensuring that the pack is loyal only to one another. It's no exaggeration to say that Valderry is the most important rite of the Sabbat. Without this supernaturally enforced loyalty to one another, the sect would have fallen apart centuries ago. The War Party. Ever since the Anarch Revolt, the Sabbat's goal has been to destroy and consume the elders that once tyrannized over them. All packs who wish to participate in a war party gather for the occasion, which is usually commemorated by various revels. Then, the highest-ranking attendant priest assumes the title Chief of the War Party. He or she then asks the attendant pack leaders if they are willing to participate. When all who are willing do so, the chief then reveals the identity of the elder whom they are to hunt down and diablerize. First to get to the elder and consume his vitae wins. Any pack who backs out after giving their affirmation is subjected to shame and ridicule. After one more night of preparatory revelry, the war party begins the hunt. Any and all means are fair, regardless of whether they violate the masquerade. The only requirement is that the pack that wins must bring back some proof of their success. Finally, the Wild Hunt, a punishment rite reserved for any member of the Sabbat who betrays it, usually by leaking important information to the Camarilla or any other declared enemy of the sect. After a formal call to the hunt, which is similar to that of a war party, The traitor is hunted down and staked. His or her crimes are then recited aloud by the ductus and pack priest of the pack to which they belonged, at which point all attendant Sabbat are expected to torture said victim until such time as they grow weary of it and then throw the immobilized vampire into a pre-prepared funeral pyre. The Sabbat then proceed to hunt down any and all vampires or humans to which the traitor may have given said information. The auctoritas rite exist in their various ways to ensure and reaffirm each Sabbat vampire's commitment to the cause. Although the modern knights have shown that maybe it's not enough. Of the three sects in the modern knights, the Sabbat have been the greatest losers. What with Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the former La Sombra Archbishop of Milan no less, leading half of his clan in a mass defection to the Camarilla, and many younger Tzimitzi being wooed by the siren song of the new anarch movement. Between all that and the Second Inquisition on the march, not to mention the massive increase in the numbers of clanless vampires as well as thin bloods, many among the Sabbat are convinced that the final nights are upon them, and that soon they will be called upon to fulfill the sect's purpose. Become in fact the sword of Cain as he returns to wreak final vengeance upon his wayward childer. Gehenna is upon them, and it is time for the Sabbat to fight.